Hello, everybody. My name is Bina Freewald. I'm a professor in the English department here and an associate of the Israeli Institute of Israel Studies, which is hosting this event, the Graduate Student Faculty Seminar. That's going to be a talk given by Dr. Aidan Beatty. Aidan holds a BA in History and Political Science from Trinity College Dublin and an MA in Modern Jewish History from the University of Chicago. He completed his PhD in International History from the University of Chicago in 2015. And his PhD dissertation won the Adele Belsimer Prize for Distinguished Dissertations of the American Conference for Irish Studies. And his first book, which is partly came out of this thesis, is entitled Masculinity and Power in Irish Nationalism, 1884 to 1938. It's forthcoming in a few months. From Palgrave Macmillan in a very prestigious series that they run, Genders and Sexualities in History. So this publication coincides with another wonderful event that has happened to Leslie and to Aidan and his wife. Leslie, the birth of their first son, Kier, a few months ago. So double congratulations to a brilliant young scholar and a new father. Aidan has taught history at the University of Chicago and at Wayne State University in Detroit. And this academic year, it's been just absolutely wonderful to have him as a postdoctoral research fellow at the Israeli Institute of Israel Studies. And he's also been a scholar in residence at the School of Canadian Irish Studies and has given a number of very well-attended and really inspiring talks. So the title of his talk today is Belfast is not here, or as it would be said in Hebrew, Po ze lo Belfast, Israeli perspectives on the Northern Irish peace process. Please help me welcome Aidan Beatty.
Thank you very much. So this is a short research project that I carried out during the year that I've been based here at the Israeli Institute and the School of Irish Studies. It in some ways grew out of my PhD research project, which, as Dr. Freywald said, was a comparative study of Zionism and Irish nationalism. And in the course of this research, I became very interested in how Irish nationalists often are very interested in Jews in a very abstract way. They often will use ideas of Jewishness to understand their own statelessness or diasporic existence and things like that. And there's a very rich literature in Jewish studies about this phenomenon of non-Jews writing about topics that often have nothing to do with Jews themselves, but that they're discussing them in a very Jewish way, or they're using a Jewish vocabulary to discuss them. Scholars like David Nuremberg, Jeremy Cohen, Jay Geller have all looked at representations of Jews in this way. So for instance, someone like Martin Luther, when he starts to think about what a reformed church that has broken from the Catholic Church would look like, he makes a lot of accusations about how Catholicism is a Judaizing religion, or that the Pope is a kind of Pharisee reborn. Or when Marx starts to think about capitalism and alienation under capitalism, he talks about Jewishness as a kind of capitalist religion. So his critique of Judaism becomes a kind of critique of capitalism. I'm very, very interested in this literature and always very impressed by it. But what I want to do with this paper, with this short research project, is in a sense to destabilize this idea of what David Nuremberg called thinking with Judaism. While many scholars have written about the phenomenon of non-Jews using abstract ideas of Jewishness in their political thought, what I'm trying to do here is to study how Jews might use decidedly non-Jewish phenomena in their political thought. So in other words, to reverse this lens of thinking with Judaism. So specifically, I want to think about how Israeli Jews used a very abstract idea of Irishness in political commentary in Israel in the late 1990s. And I want to begin all of this by looking at a very unscholarly resource. And that's the TV review column in Haaretz, the paper of record of dovish Israelis. And on the 12th of April 1998, in this column, Haaretz reported on some recent programming from Sky News, the British 24-hour rolling news channel owned by Rupert Murdoch. And mixing the political concerns of post-Oslo Accords Israel with very, very effusive prose, Haaretz's column described some recent news coverage of peace negotiations. A young and charismatic prime minister achieving a historic peace agreement. He smiles. A person who was once his enemy smiles. The American mediator smiles. All those sitting around the discussion table smile. They applaud with excited restraint. With this happy scene suitably established, Haaretz's TV columnist could deliver the grim punchline. In Hebrew, Le Rosh HaMemshalah Hatzir Haseh Lo Koraim Benjamin Netanyahu Ele Tony Blair. This young prime minister is not called Benjamin Netanyahu, but Tony Blair. As Haaretz reported, the Sky News network has not ceased broadcasting the sweet moment, which is the beginning of the end of the bloodshed, not in Israel-Palestine, but in Northern Ireland. And for a brief period, in April and May 1998, Northern Ireland became a major news story in Israel. And Haaretz's TV critic was certainly not alone in conflating Northern Ireland with politics closer to home. Indeed, many Israeli journalists and commentators, as they gazed into this Irish mirror, were actually looking back at their own Israeli political concerns. A number of astute works have compared and contrasted the Irish and Israeli peace processes. As Guy Ben-Porat, an Israeli political scientist, has said, the conflicts in Northern Ireland and Israel-Palestine, along with South Africa, have a scholarly history, as for a long time they have been packaged as classic examples of protracted ethno-national conflict involving territorial issues. This paper, however, is an examination of a specific moment in late 1990s Israel when Ireland became, even if only fleetingly, a category of Israeli political discourse. And as I said, there's a rich literature on how non-Jews have historically used Jewishness as a category of theological, political, or philosophical analysis. Little has been written, however, on how Jews might use decidedly non-Jewish categories for Jewish political analysis, and I'm trying to promote that kind of work in this paper. As one person who has talked about Ireland and Northern Ireland together, the South African-born, Northern Irish-based political scientist Adrian Gulka, as he has said, comparison is the stuff of political discourse. But first, some background on all of this. The British government had been conducting furtive contacts with various militias in Northern Ireland since at least the 1970s. With the end of the Thatcher regime in the 1990s, however, these talks began to be held openly. The 1993 Downing Street Declaration allowed the British government to publicly engage in talks with the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, as well as its political wing, Sinn Féin, or Ourselves Alone, generally presumed to be the IRA's political wing. As part of these talks, the IRA had agreed to a temporary ceasefire, though that broke down in 1996 with bombings at Canary Wharf in London and in Manchester. Notwithstanding such setbacks, however, by the latter half of the 1990s, Tony Blair's new Labour government succeeded in having the talks move to their conclusion. George Mitchell, a retired US senator, had been acting as mediator for a long series of negotiations between Protestant and Catholic political parties, and in the early months of 1998, there was much media speculation that a final peace agreement was at hand. In early April of that year, as negotiations reached an impasse, Blair, joined by his Irish counterpart, Bertie Ahern, arrived in Northern Ireland to preside over a marathon 15-hour round of talks. Protestant Unionist parties were particularly concerned over some of the specifics of the proposed peace agreement, seeing them as overly favourable to Catholic nationalist interests. Blair devoted himself to assuaging these Unionist fears, while Ahern met with nationalist leaders. The then US President, Bill Clinton, also added his support to this, personally calling various Northern Irish politicians and urging them to reach an agreement. On the 10th of April 1998, newspapers could optimistically report that a deal was at hand, and the following day, appropriately enough, Good Friday in the Christian calendar, the agreement was signed. The Good Friday Agreement, also known as the Belfast Agreement, established an autonomous parliament in Northern Ireland, the Stormont Assembly, which replaced almost 30 years of direct rule from London. Other provisions included an All-Ireland Council to deal with island-wide issues, a similar council to deal with issues pertaining to all of the British Isles, the freeing of prisoners belonging to political groups, to militant groups, which would be tied to the disarmament of these groups, reform of the police, renouncing of the Republic of Ireland's constitutional claim to sovereignty over the North, and also a referendum to ratify the agreement in both parts of Ireland. Apart from various fringe groups, the agreement was warmly greeted across the island. In May 1998, over 70% of the electorate in Northern Ireland voted in favour, along with almost 95% in the Republic. The Good Friday Agreement brought to a close a 30-year conflict whose roots in fraught Anglo-Irish relations went back much earlier, so it unsurprisingly became a major global news story. Israeli newspapers, no less than in many other parts of the world, devoted considerable attention to the successes of the peace negotiations. All the major Israeli newspapers, Haaretz, Ma'ariv, Yediot Ahronot, and the Anglophone Jerusalem Post, all published lengthy articles, opinion pieces, and multi-page spreads on Northern Ireland in April and May 1998. The front pages of these papers, usually devoted to Israeli and Middle Eastern affairs, all featured lead articles on Northern Ireland. That there were seeming parallels between Northern Ireland and Israel-Palestine was an additional factor in the press coverage, and indeed much of the Israeli press coverage of the Good Friday Agreement drew on shared vocabularies of religiously inspired nationalist violence, supposedly ancient tribal hatreds, and terrorist militias. After the successful referendum in May, Sharon Zadeh, the Haaretz correspondent for Britain, quoted one theologically minded Protestant opponent of the agreement. Zu mazima noelet lechibush et machuz hanotriut ha'achron ha'ma'amin batanach. This is a foolish plot to conquer the last Christian region that believes in the Tanakh, or in the Bible. For those of you who actually are native Hebrew speakers, I apologize for my terrible Hebrew pronunciation. This is what happens when you try to learn Hebrew with an Irish accent. And a counterpart on the other side of the communal divide was described by Sharon Zadeh as a Catholic aduk, an Orthodox or observant Catholic, using a word more ordinarily used to describe Orthodox Jews, aduk, than devout Catholics. In their two-page spread explaining the background to the conflict in Northern Ireland, Ma'ariv summed it up as hundreds of years of hatred and blood, all of which they said could be traced back to the actions of Protestant mitnachlim, or Protestant settlers, in the 17th century. Again, a word that has a very specific connotation in Israeli political discourse. And there was a basic linguistic problem that Israeli journalists faced in their coverage of Northern Ireland, namely how to translate English and Irish language terms into Hebrew. And as with many acts of translation, the words chosen echoed the political realities of the target language rather than those of the original language, of the Irish or English. So the Ulster Defence Association thus became Agudath HaHaganah Shel Ulster, and the Alliance Party became Hamifleget HaBrit, literally the party of the covenant. The seeming exoticism of Northern Ireland could thus become more recognisable to Israelis, as Irish idioms were recast into Hebrew. Those responsible for the negotiations were labelled the Givrei HaSechem HaShalom, the heroic men of the peace agreement, again using this word Givrei, with specifically Israeli and Jewish connotations. The Irish Republican Army was generally translated as Hamachterit Ha'irit, the Irish underground, or sometimes Hamachterit Ha'irit HaKatholit, the Irish Catholic underground, rather than the more literal Hatzava Ha'irit HaRepublicanit. And thus the IRA's claims to be a legitimate army could be avoided, with a name instead calling to mind perhaps the actions of the Jewish underground, Hamachterit HaYehudit, an Israeli extremist group that grew out of the settler movement in the early 1980s, perhaps suggesting that theirs also was the illegitimate form of an otherwise legitimate nationalism. Nonetheless, the IRA were also discussed in terms usually used for Palestinian groups. Their actions were just po'elet haterror, acts of terrorism. While in other cases there was a curious lack of translation, suggesting a lack of desire to fully understand the intricacies of Northern Ireland. Sinn Féin, the political wing of the IRA, whose Irish language name, as I said, means we ourselves, remained simply Sinn Féin, the Sinn Féin, and no effort was made to explain the nationalist meaning of this name. Bloody Sunday, the shooting of 13 civil rights protesters in Derry in 1972, usually in Israeli newspapers just remained Bloody Sunday, transliterated directly into Hebrew. In one of the most evocative pieces from this wave of Israeli reporting on Northern Ireland, the peace activist and journalist Igal Sarna recounted his meetings with Catholics in Belfast. Joining a Catholic parade, he said, "I walked with the marchers to the graves of the IRA dead." Sarna reported a far more subdued, even solemn atmosphere than the elation found in most newspaper headlines. "We departed on a new road from a history of death," said the politicians, but the Catholics of Belfast with whom I marched used lower and more quotidian words. And the somber mood evoked some very interesting memories for Igal Sarna. As a fairly lonely Israeli in the parade that passed beneath light snow in poor and sad neighbourhoods, I thought about the hope of Belfast, but also about the danger that was within it. I carry with me abilities of a small group or of one man to put an end to the painstaking work of 100 wise diplomats. The pitfalls of failed peace agreements were, for Sarna, a poignant reminder of the murder of Yitzhak Rabin. Israel may have once shared similarities with Northern Ireland, but he said from this week it seemed that from now on the roads depart. Belfast says bye-bye to Tel Aviv. And with the ending of both the Northern Irish Troubles and South African apartheid, Sarna started to feel that Israel remains, as he says, a kind of archival relic of a conflict. What Sarna presents as the tragedy of post-Oslo Israel stands in contrast to the politicians' expectations for Northern Ireland. And Sarna quotes one local political commentator who, with a suspiciously Hanukkah-inflected flourish, felt that Nas Gadol Kara Po, a great miracle happened here. So Sarna was clearly investing the events in Northern Ireland with meanings drawn from Jewish and Israeli political discourse. More specifically, he was using Ireland in quotes, as a set of ideas to talk about Israeli politics, a common discursive move in much of the Israeli reporting on Northern Ireland. The Ireland that appears in the Israeli press is one that would not always be immediately recognisable to Irish people. Rather, it's an Ireland reconstructed for Israelis. And as Israelis talk about and with this imaginary Ireland, they're actually talking about their own domestic political concerns. Igal Sarna's journalistic approach, which drew deep comparisons between Northern Ireland and the Middle East, was echoed in much of the Israeli press coverage of the Good Friday Agreement, facilitated by the fact that leading political figures themselves made this comparison. Bill Clinton argued that the Belfast Agreement provided key lessons for Israelis and Palestinians, and he claimed that Israel-Palestine would be soon added to Bosnia, Haiti, and Northern Ireland, troubled regions where American mediation had helped bring peace. Tony Blair not only drew similar comparisons, but also visited Israel in the days after the signing of the agreement. In an opinion piece which he wrote for the English language Jerusalem Post, which also appeared in the Palestinian newspaper Al-Quds, he urged Israelis and Palestinians to learn from the lessons of Northern Ireland. There have been plenty of times, he said, when people told me the peace process in Northern Ireland was pointless, that there was nothing anybody could do, that we should simply give up. But the minute you accept that, you can't ever make progress. My own experience has taught me that the search for peace is never easy, and there will be many disappointments along the way. But we must all keep trying. The present peace process still offers the best chance for a better future. And he's clearly talking about both Israel, Palestine, and Northern Ireland in that one sentence. Blair's Northern Ireland Secretary Mo Molan was even less circumspect, asserting on May 1998, if Northern Ireland is able to reach a peace agreement, Israel and the Palestinians are also able to do this. And a number of Arab leaders made similar claims. Yasser Arafat spoke of the need to bring pressure on Israel after Northern Ireland, and the Jordanian Foreign Minister Jawad al-Anani stated that the Good Friday Agreement serves as an example of what needs to be done to open up a channel of Israeli-Palestinian discussions. There is a need for the full intervention of an American mediator and goodwill between the two sides, particularly on the Israeli side, the Jordanian said, in order to achieve solutions to problems. And both Sinn Féin and the more moderate Nationalist Party, the Social Democratic Labour Party, also regularly made this comparison at this time. A number of Israeli journalists and political commentators ploughed a similar comparative furrow. David Newman, a British-born Israeli academic, used his column in the Jerusalem Post to sketch out a number of ways in which Northern Ireland and Israel could be understood together. Newman compared the first public meeting between Tony Blair and Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams to the 1993 meeting between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, and spoke of how a need for reconciliation and education about each other was at work in both contexts. On a deeper level, Newman also suggested that a new comparison was emerging. He spoke of Catholics and Protestants successfully building long-term stability and an end to violence, where on the other hand, Israel and the Palestinians have failed to live up to the euphoria and the expectations which he said were present in the heady days following the two Oslo agreements. So Northern Ireland provided a way for Newman to highlight the shortcomings of the Oslo Accords. While alive to the possibility that opponents to the Irish peace agreement could still wreck its chances, he argued that the use of island-wide referenda imbued the agreement with popular support, and he regretted that this option had not been pursued by the Rabin government after the signing of the Oslo Accords. Had there been a referendum shortly after the signing of the Oslo Agreement, he said, the chances of a large majority in favour would have provided the Rabin government with the necessary mandate for its implementation. This would also have taken the wind out of the right-wing opposition, he said, in their attempts to delegitimise the government by arguing that it lacked the necessary popular mandate for making such far-reaching concessions. So as David Newman gazed longingly at Northern Ireland, he saw a polity where right-wing extremists had been circumvented by a democratic process that taps the essentially dovish sensibilities of the general population. His wish was clearly that Israel could be like Northern Ireland, and his closing words for his readers were, "We should wish peaceful Catholics and Protestants the very best of Irish luck." Pathos and even a sense of envy were even more apparent in an article written by Tammy Shiloh for Mahariv. Shiloh recognised the Israeli temptation to find meaning in the Northern Irish peace process, but felt it is more important that the deal in Ireland may have practical and direct implications for the peace process in our region, due to the simple fact that it will give a renewed impetus to the international, mainly American desire to solve any and all conflicts. Northern Ireland and Israel-Palestine had stood as two of the Western world's few violent conflicts based on a lethal mix of religion, nationality and territory. But now that Northern Ireland had moved past this dangerous state, Shiloh said, Israel appeared as something of an anomaly. From today, Israel is even more unusual in this world, even more of a lonely soul, was Shiloh's mournful prognostication. We are even more alone. Immanuel Gutman, a political scientist at the Hebrew University, had less emotion on display in a questions and answers piece for Yetiot Ahronoth, but nonetheless was unambiguous in his view that the peace process in Northern Ireland was an example worthy of Israeli emulation. The Good Friday Agreement, Gutman said, was the product of Britain's suitably flexible Labour Party. And referencing a set of political concerns familiar to Israelis, he talked of how the ice broke after the Labour government agreed to compromise on the strict sovereignty clause, a step that the Conservatives were not capable of doing. Compromises do not indicate weakness, Gutman adamantly said, and to the question, can Israel and the Palestinians learn from the agreement, Gutman had a straightforward answer. Both sides will need to compromise, and he said hostile nations or groups that lived by the sword for many years will eventually get very bored. In two very striking cartoons, Haaretz pursued the comparison of Northern Ireland and Israel-Palestine further, and drew on some surprisingly deep veins of Jewish religious thought in the process. In this caricature entitled "Four Sons Discuss Torah Differently," Two men representing the divided Catholic and Protestant communities in Northern Ireland, or Swan, Ireland, here on the right, embrace, having placed their weapons in the dustbin of history. In stark contrast, two other figures representing Yasser Arafat and the State of Israel, or perhaps just Benjamin Netanyahu, stubbornly refuse to even face each other, much less embrace, although their glancing eye lines do suggest that they have a continued interest in each other. The title of the cartoon references the standard Passover Haggadah and the story of the four sons who all relate to their Jewish heritage in abruptly different ways. The wise son, the simple son, the wicked son, and the son who does not know how to ask. So not only is there the inference that Netanyahu and Arafat embody the wicked son and the son who does not know how to ask for peace, but there's also, I think, a wonderful, if sarcastic, allegation that Northern Irish Catholics and Protestants are better, more peace-seeking Jews than anyone can find in the State of Israel. In other words, there's again a very familiar refrain. Why can Israelis not be more like Northern Irish Catholics or Protestants? A second Passover-themed cartoon in Haaretz depicted Netanyahu with his family. Though participating in their traditional Passover Seder, this modern-style family continued to watch TV through dinner. On the TV, tuned to CNN, Bill Clinton stands by a bank of microphones against the backdrop of British and Irish flags. To what appears to be Netanyahu's embarrassment, the American president is announcing Leshana Haba Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, again a central part of the Passover liturgy. The obvious message is that within a year, Clinton will bring Northern Irish-style peace to Israel-Palestine, which is presumably the reason for Netanyahu's awkward facial grimace. Clinton's words, however, are not written in Hebrew, but instead are transliterated into a Latin script, suggesting that this future peace mission is something foreign to Israeli concerns. In contrast to the claim that Israel should emulate the Good Friday Agreement, a significant section of the Israeli commentariat engaged in a willful refusal to ever make this comparison. Nonetheless, how these pundits discussed Ireland, or rather refused to discuss Ireland, revealed much about their views of Israeli realities. Zalman Shoval, a former Knesset member for Likud, produced an opinion piece for Yediot Achronot with the decidedly blunt title of Belfast ze lo ka'am. Belfast is not here. Shoval began by taking aim at Bill Clinton's assertions that US-mediated peace agreements in Northern Ireland, Bosnia, or Haiti could now be followed with an American arbitration in Israel-Palestine. Not only did he dismiss the depth of the peace agreements in Haiti and the former Yugoslavia, he also expressed serious pessimism about the future successes of George Mitchell's work in Northern Ireland. He followed this up by zeroing in on what he saw as a major difference between the Oslo Accords and the Good Friday Agreement. While the Irish Agreement is said to be a final peace agreement, he said, a permanent deal in the language of the Middle East, Oslo represents a sequence of interim deals without a peace agreement. Shoval then proceeded to identify what he felt was the essential difference between Northern Ireland and Israel-Palestine. That of the basic fundamental political assumptions that animate the opposing sides in both conflicts. Northern Irish Catholics, he pointed out, had been willing to forego any separate sovereignty, something that Palestinians would not do. Moreover, he argued, Northern Irish Protestants did not face what he felt were the existential problems that Israelis faced. Northern Ireland is Protestant, but with a large Catholic minority. It is not surrounded, he said, like Israel, by a hostile and powerful world with 85 times more of a population than the number of its inhabitants, with substantial parts of the outside world on the inside since before it came into existence, a reference to Israeli Arabs. And pushing his point further, Shoval ended by arguing that the government of the Republic of Ireland, in their willingness to revoke constitutional claims of sovereignty over the North, treated peace with far greater seriousness than the Palestinians, who, notwithstanding all their promises, have not yet cancelled their covenant calling for the destruction of Israel. Moshe Zak, the former editor of Mahariv, used his English language column in the Jerusalem Post to make a very similar set of claims in an article entitled "Belfast is Certainly No Oslo." His bold opening salvo was that there is no similarity between the Oslo Agreement signed in 1993 between Israel and the Palestinians and the Belfast Agreement reached in 1998 between the Catholics and Protestants in Northern Ireland. And he was very clear in his view that the Good Friday Agreement could never serve as a model for Israeli-Palestinian peace. For Zach, the positive role of the European Union in Northern Ireland versus what he saw as negative European interference in Israel, as well as the absence of similarly negative United Nations resolutions, deepened the breach between the two contexts. Zach's stance was in fact echoed throughout the pages of the Jerusalem Post. An editorial in early April 1998 accused the British and Irish governments of papering over serious problems in Northern Ireland in favour of pursuing what they tartly labelled a designer peace process, one that would almost certainly fail. An editorial a week later did note that many of the problems in negotiating an end to this conflict, whose roots go back several centuries and has claimed 3,000 lives in the last 30 years, are familiar to Middle Easterners, but still concluded on a note of contrast rather than comparison. On the positive side, compared to the Middle East, there are no outside radical states seeking to undermine peace in order to further their own ambitions. There are no holy sites or massive refugee problems involved. The national survival of neither Britain nor Ireland is at stake. Another Jerusalem Post editorial the following day took a similarly cautious approach to the question of comparing and contrasting either peace processes. And as the South African political scientist Adrian Beatty has said, it is not difficult to come up with examples of fruitful comparisons in the field of political analysis that have little resonance in the realm of political discourse. Gap between what social scientists say are the comparisons and what political commentators say are the comparisons. Geula Cohen, a veteran figure on the right flank of Israeli politics, talked of how she had long had a great empathy with the Irish underground fighters, or Lochemei HaMechteret HaIrit, where a number of scholars have argued that right-wing Zionism shares a settler colonialist impulse with Ulster Unionism. Cohen instead argued that the true ideological empathy was the tendency towards heroic self-sacrifice of both Zionists and Irish Republican hunger strikers, whom she claimed she had long had sympathy for. She went on to say that the peace agreement in Northern Ireland shows how even deep and difficult crises could be eventually solved, but this did not prompt her to see a solution for Israel-Palestine in the Good Friday Agreement. For us, she says, there are no possibilities of compromise with the Arabs. It is not possible that there will be one Palestinian state in Jordan, a second in Judea and Samaria, in other words the West Bank, and a third after that in Tel Aviv. The wrong compromise begets war, she said. A compromise is a solution when it is just, and the only solution for us will be when the Arabs have official state sovereignty in Jordan. In other words, she refuses to accept the idea of a two-state solution. But it was not just those on the right wing of Israeli politics who argued that Northern Ireland was radically dissimilar to Israel-Palestine. Shlomo Ben-Ami, a member of the Labour Party and later a member of the dovish Meretz party, sarcastically argued that the shared settler colonial history of Israelis and Northern Irish Protestants should act as a source of inspiration for the Israeli right wing. In the same half-mocking tone, he claimed that Northern Ireland provided no lessons for Israeli politics. The British had recognised the legitimacy of Irish state sovereignty in the Republic, something he accusingly said right-wing Israelis refused to do for the Palestinians. Conversely, Yossi Olmert, brother of the future Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, and a participant in former Israeli peace negotiations, felt that there were lessons to draw from Northern Ireland, but not the same lessons that any others chose to take away. In a piece that he wrote for the Jerusalem Post, Olmert constructed a narrative of unyielding British resolve in the face of Irish terrorism. This strength served to test the genuineness of Sinn Féin's commitment to peace. Yasser Arafat's PLO, on the other hand, he said, was exempted from this unavoidable test, and the horrific results were written in blood all over Israel. So for Olmert, the lesson of Northern Ireland was that Oslo-era Israeli leaders had been too dovish, and only an iron wall-like approach could bring an end to terrorism. Northern Ireland, he suggested, had avoided the mistaken example set by the architects of the Oslo Accords. One final set of articles that looked at Northern Ireland moved away from political negotiations or religious violence, instead placing the emphasis on the uniquely cultural and creative nature of the Irish people. As an editorial in the Jerusalem Post baldly asserted, the nature of the Northern Irish peace process was such that it approached being a form of shadow theatre, a surreal series of events, as they said, scripted by an Irish playwright, of course. Mythic proportion has given way to Monty Python. Thomas O'Dwyer, an Irish-born columnist for the Jerusalem Post, continued in this cultural mode, referencing various statements made by the Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney in a piece he wrote for the Irish Times. O'Dwyer claimed that it is typical of the Irish to take the opinion of a visionary poet more seriously than that of any politician. A piece in Mahariv traced the effect of the national struggle on the works of Ireland's Anashe Haruach, literally meaning people of the spirit, usually taken to mean something like intellectuals or philosophers. Mahariv provided an eclectic photo collage to help define this otherwise hard to translate term. The pop musicians Sinead O'Connor and U2, the writers James Joyce, Samuel Beckett and Oscar Wilde, the actors Liam Neeson and Daniel Day-Lewis, the latter of whom was not actually born in Ireland, was English born and became an Irish citizen, and then for some reason George Best, who played soccer for Manchester United in the 1960s. The article talked of Ireland as being ever and always a land of cultural creativity, and explained this as the direct result of the ongoing clash with Britain. And while the Mahariv piece identified this conflict-born aestheticism in film and literature, it placed a particular emphasis on music. The national songs of the Irish, from Danny Boy to The Rising of the Moon, deal with combat, death and bereavement. In recent decades, a variety of rock stars have come out of Ireland, many of whom continue to deal with these themes. U2 became the most important band in the world with the song Bloody Sunday, commemorating a massacre of civilians in Northern Ireland at the hands of the British in 1972. Clannad worked in the ancient Gaelic language. Sinead O'Connor denounced the British brutality that led to the Great Famine in the 19th century. The Cranberries sang about the zombies, the living dead on the streets of Belfast. Now, much of this can be explained as a function of print capitalism and the presumed need to provide celebrity content to tabloid newspaper readers. But I want to suggest that there also seems to be a deeper imperative at work here. By constructing them as a uniquely creative, even spiritual people, journalism such as this serve to exoticize the Irish, and thus to reinforce perceptions that the actions of the Irish bear no comparison to the supposedly harsher realities of the Middle East. Indeed, this Israeli focus on Irish music and Irish culture can be placed in a much longer history of perceptions about Irish people's supposedly inherent artistic or poetic sensibilities. Consciously or not, news coverage like this echoed the famous views of Ernest Renan and Matthew Arnold in the 19th century that Celts are a wonderfully poetic, if politically naive people. And it's a small leap from seeing the Irish as a uniquely artistic people to seeing their peace process as the product of a gentler or perhaps more artistic conflict. Again, the precise ways in which Israeli media covered events in Northern Ireland in the spring of 1998 did important work for Israeli popular political discourse. Another function of print capitalism and the general workings of the media industry is how quickly Northern Ireland disappeared as a major story from the pages of Israeli newspapers. After the successful referendum of May 1998, attentions were turned elsewhere. Israel's brief Northern Ireland moment had ended. Nonetheless, the sporadic mentions of Irish themes in Israeli newspapers continue to reflect Israeli political concerns. 15 years after the Good Friday Agreement, Haaretz returned to Northern Ireland to report on the historic reconciliation that had allowed the small territory to outgrow deep religious hatred and learn to live together. Haaretz's Haggai Matar claimed that there is a reason for optimism. 2 years later, however, Haaretz spoke more grimly about the lesson of Northern Ireland in terms of a rhetorical question. Can there be peace without justice? Whatever hopes had surrounded the Oslo Accords had dissipated into a kind of bleak pragmatism. Writing in Yetiot Aharonoth in 2011, Yitzhak Ben-Horon, the newspaper's Washington correspondent, reported with an air of satisfaction that even George Mitchell had admitted the reality in the Middle East is much more complex, and peace would be harder to achieve in Israel-Palestine than in Northern Ireland. When Ireland does feature as a newspaper topic in Israel today, it is less in terms of shared hopes for peace and more in terms of widespread Irish support for Palestinians. Reflecting major shifts in post-Oslo, post-Second Intifada, post-Arab Spring Israel, the focus is on what is presented as European apathy in the face of Islamist terror, international hostility to Israel, and the looming threat of boycotts, divestments, and sanctions. An article in Mahariv in 2012 talked of how Ireland was now one of the most hostile states towards Israel, and with an almost pathetically resigned air asked, "Ma koreh leyedidah ha-pastoralit shel Yisrael?" What happened to the pastoral friend of Israel? Showing that Ireland and ideas of Ireland can still remain discursive tools for understanding Israeli political concerns. And all of this perhaps confirms what the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, Meron Ben-Venisti, once said, that only those who have experienced the dichotomous environments of Sarajevo, Beirut, or Belfast can truly comprehend the phenomenon of the white patches on the mental maps carried around in the heads of the Jews and Arabs of Eretz Yisrael, Palestine. Thank you.
Aidan would be very happy to engage with your comments and questions.
No, I am probably a real minority in this room. I'm a descendant of Jewish Irish families in Dublin. I don't know if I have anybody else here who is. Originally from Lithuania. At the end of the 19th century, they traveled to Dublin. My mother was born there, my grandmother was raised there. You mentioned Belfast, which was, of course, a very different part of it. But you did not mention at all, and I was hoping you might, the Jewish presence in, because of the topic, the Jewish presence in Ireland. It was at one time up to about 5,000 people in Dublin. Have you studied that aspect at all?
If you'd come to a talk I gave last month, I would have talked about all this.
You didn't.
I have, not in a very systematic way. That's a community that has really gone into decline since World War II, partly because of what I presume has happened to you, that a lot of people left. It's very hard, as a community, as you get kind of out migration, that's a cause and an effect of the shrinkage of the community. That it becomes harder to lead a Jewish life if there are not as many Jews around. It's harder to find a Jewish spouse. It's harder to find Jewish schools and things like that. I don't know if you have specific questions about that community, or.
I just wondered. I mean, you were talking about Northern Ireland and the Catholic and Protestant war, if you will. And yet, I know that I was told by my grandmother, this is hearsay, that the Jews were quite welcome in Dublin. They had their own community, their own neighborhood, and they had several synagogues, etc., but not so in Belfast. In fact, there was a monument to Herzog that was taken down in Belfast in recent times. So I'm just wondering, where's the comparison to Israel where, I mean, here you're talking about Irish fighting Irish. Israel, it's not Israelis fighting Israelis. There's a whole disconnect, quite different.
Well, I think if you said what you just said to a Northern Irish person, to a Northern Irish Protestant who was very supportive of the kind of, I would say, of the Ulster Defence Association, they would say it's not Irish fighting Irish. It's Irish fighting Scottish, Ulster Scottish people, or British. Yeah, that they're defending their British identity in Ireland. And there's a sort of a long literature of this, which I think can be a very selective kind of literature of saying, Israel is just like Northern Ireland. Israelis are just like Northern Irish Protestants. That they're a kind of besieged, they feel that they're a besieged minority surrounded by a hostile broader world, whether it's Irish Catholics or Arabs. And I'm very interested in kind of flipping that around and saying, well, actually, Zionists are very like Irish nationalists. You know, Ulster Unionists will admit, look, we weren't always here, but we've been here for a long time and we deserve to stay. That's more or less what Palestinians say. Northern Irish people and Irish nationalists and Zionists would both say, no, we're the ones with the real mystical connection to the land. You can find comparisons that kind of go both ways. So there are comparisons and there are differences, I think, between comparing Zionism to Northern Irish Protestants or comparing Zionism to Irish nationalists. Bina?
You can moderate it.
As a former North of Irelander, the experience, I put forward the reality that the peace process, the Good Friday Agreement, was not determined necessarily and only by the willingness on both sides to come to an agreement. There is a reality in Northern Ireland for the last 5-10 years. When Ireland was divided, the loyalist community in the north represented 2/3 of the population. The nationalist, notice by the way I prefer to use the word nationalist and loyalist than Protestant Catholic, was 1/3. That has all changed now. It is the nationalist population of Northern Ireland is about 50 and growing, whereas the loyalist population is in decline. For a few years back in Queen's University Belfast, the nationalist Catholic population student body bypassed the loyalist student body. I want to ask, is there any that's one part of my comment. The other part was in the Israeli media, do they make reference to the fact that there were so many divisions within the IRA, the pro-vote, the real IRA, and they did not all agree? So was that reflected? Was there an awareness of that in the media?
Not hugely, no. That's very. They don't really go into a huge amount of detail about these kind of internal Republican divisions. Now, I've not looked to say what happens in 2005. I sort of did, what a lot of scholars do. I just go on databases and look for every time Ireland is mentioned, and hope that gets me everything.
Okay.
So they don't go into a huge amount of information about kind of the internal Republican debates. I suspect most international correspondents don't do that because it's kind of inaccessible in some ways, and it goes against a certain kind of narrative of this successful peace process. I also think Israelis don't go into it because I suspect that they're not really interested in Northern Ireland in and of itself. They're interested in what Northern Ireland tells them about Israel. In response to your first question, I would say then if you were to make a comparison between Northern Ireland today and a Middle Eastern country, I wouldn't compare it to Israel-Palestine. I would compare it to Lebanon, where you have a very similar thing that the peace process has done of entrenching sectarian division. Because of the way the parliament was set up after the Good Friday Agreement, it's very similar to Lebanon, that in Northern Ireland, the First Minister has to be a Protestant, the Deputy First Minister has to be a Catholic, the two parties, the largest Catholic party and the largest Protestant party have to share power. So there's no point in voting on kind of ideological grounds. You have to vote, if you want your vote to matter, on sectarian grounds, which is very similar to how politics works in Lebanon, where the president has to be of one particular religious group, the prime minister, the chief of staff of the army, the speaker of the house. It kind of entrenches sectarianism and becomes a kind of self-reinforcing sectarianism, which goes against a lot of the kind of how wonderful Northern Ireland has become, that there is this seething, entrenched structural sectarianism that I think still exists there.
Dora?
Yes, it's just a trope that I think in the late 90s, one of the things that one could say was similar for the Israelis and what they found positive, I think, in the Irish event was the hate of the British. because many Israelis, especially those who still remembered what went on pre-48 and during 48, was the British were the hated, not the Arabs. British were worse than the Arabs. And that trope carried through for many, many years in Israel. So looking at the Brits as the cause of all the problems and getting rid of the Brits seemed like a very positive thing to Israeli media and to Israeli nationalism.
I think you can see this here.
So
it's a very and even in Geula Cohen, who I quoted, who says, you know, I always loved the IRA hunger strikers in the early 80s, which really kind of shocked me because they would not have liked her.
No.
But she frames it as it's very kind of, she's kind of dealing with, she has this memory of like Irgun and the Stern Gang.
She was a member.
Oh, she was, okay.
She was the broadcaster.
Okay. Oh, there you go.
But on the other hand, the IRA in the 60s and 70s was openly allied with the Palestine Liberation.
And that's why I was surprised by this. That's why they wouldn't have liked her. They would have seen her as an agent of Zionist imperialism or something like that.
They trained together.
I think one of the things, it was interesting to hear the lecture and how the different newspapers covered or different commentators covered the peace agreements, because there was something about the peace agreement that was very heartening to people who believed in the peace process. It validated the peace process for Israelis. And it made it, at that time in 1998, there was a feeling that there was something inevitable about the peace process. And by Ireland having this Good Friday process, it proved it. Or it said, this is a world trend, this is a zeitgeist. And this is something to pay attention to. We have to learn about it. And what is happening actually in Ireland might not be that important as how it is reflected for Jews in Israel. And that reality didn't last, but it was something that there was so much hope invested in it. It was also a reflection of how good the Oslo Accords was, because if the Oslo Accords could give hope to other parts of the world, that if there's a peace in Israel, between Israel and the Palestinians, therefore there could be peace in other parts of the world inspired by what happened in Oslo. And that was what I think was a stream among supporters of the peace process at that time.
Yeah, I think what you can see here is this kind of a very specific moment, right? I mean, where there's still this kind of lingering hope for Oslo, but you still haven't had the Second Intifada. So there's a belief that this still could work. Around the time of the Good Friday Agreement, there was a cartoon in Le Monde, the French newspaper, of Arafat and Rabin, Mandela and de Klerk, all sitting in a cafe, and they're drinking champagne, and a member of the IRA is walking in, and the caption said something like, "We've been waiting for you." So there is, I think you're absolutely right. There is this kind of, it's an international moment after the end of the Cold War, where there is this expectation that things can get better, and you can still see that hope in how this is reported.
And Tony Blair is such a hero at that time.
At that time, yeah.
Aidan?
Yeah, and then Sean. Well, yeah.
Just one question about, actually, let's take it to 2009, when the same George Mitchell was appointed by Obama to try to reach an agreement between Israel and Palestinians. Did you sense any return to, flashback to, okay, he's coming with his experience, and now let's see if we have any comparison between the two situations in the Israeli press?
Well, some of these pieces that I quote at the end are from Mitchell coming.
Okay.
But I think there's a set, that's where you start to get also a lot of reportage about, yes, he brought peace in Northern Ireland, but this is very different. This is much more complex. The one thing that I thought I would get a lot more of, and I didn't really see at all, was much more commentary on, but that's not a conflict with Islamic terrorism. And I was quite surprised by that there's no reference to the fact that these are Christians, or that at least they're non-Muslims. I thought that would be something that would figure a lot more, and it didn't figure at all, from anything I found anyway. Sean?
One of the interesting parts of the Good Friday Agreement is this idea that if it's, and we told this, I hope it's true, that it's, at some point, there's a majority, Republican majority in the North, then the North can unite with the South. That's, that at least I've been told. In other words, there's a sense that demographic problems are going to be solved by a sort of majority of the population, without displacement of the population. Was there at some point an expectation among some groups in Ireland that there would be displacement of the population? And did this sort of democratic solution of we'll go by majority replace that? Was that a difficult process? How did that whole process work? And what does that have to say?
No, in terms of, we've seen like a population transfer like between Greece and Italy, Greece and Turkey.
Yes, yeah, Pakistan.
Nothing. There's never been anything like that. I mean, there are sort of informally there have been people who move, and that's one of the things that has happened with a lot of younger middle class Ulster Protestants, Ulster Unionists, whatever you want to call them. A lot of the reasons, say, why Queen's now the largest university in Northern Ireland has a majority Catholic population, is because upwardly mobile young Ulster Protestants go to college in Britain, or they go to college in Dublin. I went to Trinity, which is a historically Protestant university, but today has a mostly Catholic origin student population. But there's a huge contingent in Dublin of Northern Irish Protestants who come to college there. So there have been kind of, I wouldn't call them population transfers, but there's kind of out-migration. Catholics also tend to have larger families. That there is a lot of discussion in '98 about this idea that if there is eventually a Catholic...
98?
In 1998?
Oh, 98.
That if there is eventually a Catholic majority, that then there can be another referendum, but there's no legal sort of stipulation of that. I can't imagine that people like David Trimble would ever have agreed to the Good Friday Agreement if that had been a set clause in it. But there is a fear, and that's a major cause of problem right now in Northern Ireland, a fear that eventually, very soon, there will be more Catholics. It's something like 40, 60, and that will eventually change the demographic realities. It will then change the political realities.
Yeah, one of the points you're just making about the universities, what's happening with a lot of the Protestant population in Northern Ireland when they graduate from secondary school, there's a tendency to go to university in what they refer to as the mainland, England, Scotland or Wales. A lot of people at university, of course, when they graduate, they get an offer of a job, they might meet a future spouse. So in actual fact, there's, in my estimation, a Protestant brain drain in Northern Ireland.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of them are not going back. And some recent research indicate that only a third of school kids are actually Protestant in Northern Ireland. And I think this year was the turning point when actual fact was a Catholic majority for the first time ever when you take the total population into consideration.
Yeah, it kind of fits with all of this.
Yeah, that's not to say, of course, that all Catholics are nationalists, because I think the percentage changes depending on the strength of the economy and the republic. But what has happened is there's definitely a trend, and I think that a lot of the Protestant Unionists realize this, that maybe the day is coming when we will be a minority demographically.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and this is sort of a cause of a lot of anxiety.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm wondering, is it true that in the 80s and up until the peace accord, in Belfast, Loyalist community unionists would often wear a Star of David to show...
Well, yeah, that's still true.
How? Is that still true?
Yeah, you'll still see that. This kind of goes back to this thing of the sort of the Stern Gang. It partly comes out of this kind of ideological affinity between Irish Republicans and Palestinian nationalists. Partly also that there are certain links between the two, although it's very difficult to actually study that kind of thing because you're talking about arms dealing and terrorist organizations that tend not to give, they tend not to have archives that you can go study.
Is it mainstream, like a middle class mainstream thing, or would it be more fringe?
I think it would be within people who are already supporters of the IRA and so on. And then that creates a kind of there's a support for Palestinians as a result of that, which then creates a kind of a desire to have a support for Israelis, just as a kind of knee-jerk reaction against that. But because of the Stern Gang, there was kind of hesitancy for a while, as I understand it, among Ulster Unionists to actually support Israel because it was seen as an anti-British state. There's a similar thing with Irish nationalists in sort of Republican areas of Belfast. You'll sometimes see Basque flags, but they've never gone so far in unit areas to have Spanish flags, because that's too much of that's a step too far. It's one thing to be pro-Israeli, but you don't want to be pro-Spaniard.
Spain and England were, you know, if you go back far enough, they were antagonists,
Mhm.
and the British Navy won. So, you know, it's a joke. And so my question would be, were there any social movements, and I'm very not knowledgeable about this, are there very social movements between Protestants and Catholics that sort of traverse the lines of conflict before the peace agreement and start discussing peace and the possibility of peace, or was that kind of thing anathema, like, but there have been too much social punishment from your own side to go out and try and reach out? And that's why I'm just going to ask you, to what extent were there subjective versus objective approaches to peace influential in Ireland? I know that they're present in sort of both the diaspora for the Jewish community, where groups of Palestinians and Muslims and Jews get together and talk, and it's families, and they construct a kindergarten or a playground, or they talk about it. And there are groups and movements like that in Israel. So were there any comparative movements? Because that's another point of comparison for like social movements and their approach, sort of reaching across to the other side, or would that have been prohibited? Like would there have been retaliation from your own side?
I think it would depend on which part of Northern Irish society you're talking about. The IRA always had much stronger support in working class areas, and you're far less likely to see that kind of stuff there. It tends to be a very middle class thing when it does happen, where you have kind of you know, cross communal links.
Yeah.
There is a political party called the Alliance Party that stood as a kind of a Protestant Catholic party. It gets a lot of hostility from Irish Republicans because they would still say, well, that's still a unionist party. It still believes that Northern Ireland should stay part of Great Britain.
Like, was there an Irish peace now?
No.
On either side, no.
Not that, I mean, nothing that would have had the kind of status that peace now had in the 80s in Israeli society.
And we could,
But there was parties in the Republic that would have been supportive of peace processes.
Yeah.
So there are kind of different avenues for people who want to work for peace, but not constructed in the same way.
But not like circles of mothers bringing their children together and forming social groups, like informal social groups.
Offhand, I don't know.
Okay.
and we can take perhaps one last question. Yes.
I simply wanted to mention the name James Joyce, because of course in his great novel Ulysses, the central character is Leopold Bloom, who is a Jewish man living in that city of Dublin. And I wanted to suggest that perhaps you might be interested in yet another talk that won't be directly about this topic, but we'll talk about Exodus and the whole area of, it's going to be taught by Abby Bender, who's a professor at the Glucksman School in New York University, and it'll be called Israelites in Erin. Israelites in Erin, and it's going to be centered on the literature and especially on the book of Mr. Joyce, and it's the 5th annual Festival of Bloomsday, and it will be held at the Jewish Public Library on whatever, of course, Bloomsday, the 16th of June, right? 2015. So you might be interested if you are, come and see me before you go over, and I can get you information about this. It's a very interesting lady. We've had 3 talks now at the Jewish Public Library, and we're going to do yet another one. And we hope, again, the Irish ambassador will be there.
Nice note to end on. See you all there, and thank you very much, Aidan.